let's suppose a company is a vile polluter of a stream. That company can raise its ESG score by adding LGBT people to its board. It can do training on critical race theory. It can try to convince its people that we're a racist society, and that raises their ESG score, and they don't have to address the fact that they're polluting local streams.
Welcome, everybody, to Conversations That Matter. I'm your host, Alex Newman. We have a very special guest with us today. His name is Joe Golding. He is an entrepreneur, a business executive, a speaker, an executive coach, and he is really active in a very important fight right now that you may not have even heard of unless you're closely following the New American or a handful of other sources. But they are trying to build these massive pipelines through the Midwest that are going to do carbon capture. They're going to basically take CO2 supposedly and pump it underground, if I understand, deal with it somehow so that supposedly it doesn't kill us all with global warming. The big problem with that is they're going to have to be taking tons of private property from people. And so Joe has been one of the leaders. His wife is a state rep. They've been kind of leading this fight, and there are others involved as well. Before we get to Joe, he started multiple very successful businesses. He's got 6 children, 21 grandchildren. One of the companies they started, Advancement Resources, they sold it off, but it is one of the global leaders in philanthropic thinking, implementation, and education. Joe, welcome to the program. And for the folks out there who aren't familiar with the battle that's happening right now in Iowa and the Dakotas over these carbon capture pipelines, give us kind of an overview of what is going on.
Well, I wasn't aware of this either until we got notice that several of our farms are going to be crossed by carbon capture pipelines. And so my background is really in research. So I started some research to figure out what it was, the impact it was going to have. And I think I could summarize months of research and work by saying that there are really 2 completely separate groups that are in favor of and opposed to this. Now, keep in mind that the whole idea of carbon capture and sequestration, which means burying it underground a mile at very high pressure, where it supposedly will stay forever, or they say permanently. And by the way, whether you say forever or permanently, that's a long time. But there are 2 groups that are surprising in terms of how they feel about this. So one group, keep in mind that this is supposedly all about the climate change and global warming and all the other stuff that's the dire consequences of which we hear about on a regular basis. But one group that's completely in favor of this whole idea of carbon sequestration is big oil. And I want to talk about that a little bit because it seems like odd that big oil would suddenly be into an environmental situation like this. But the groups that are completely opposed to it are the environmental groups. Now, doesn't this seem completely opposite of what one would expect? And so big oil, if you think about big oil is in favor of this because during their processes, they emit carbon dioxide. And all of a sudden, the government has said to them that if you capture this carbon dioxide, compress it, dry it, compress it, pump it underground for however many miles, and put it in the ground where it will stay forever, we will give you money to do that. So you think about it from a corporation's viewpoint, here's a waste byproduct. It's of absolutely no value whatsoever. Right now, you're just putting it out smokestacks, and suddenly the government's going to pay you to do something with it. So it's a great source of profitability. Okay, so that makes some sense. But then if this is such a great thing to address climate change, why would environmental forces be opposed to it? And the reason that they are, and talking about the Sierra Club or any other environment group, is because they know it doesn't work. It doesn't really solve the problem. But what it does do is it takes tremendous resources that could be spent on research, on technologies to actually address environmental issues. And it gives that to corporations who are actually polluters. So one of the first things I discovered in analyzing this is that the people who are lined up opposed and against are completely different from what one would expect. And so that began a need for a lot more research on what this really is, why it's promoted, and what's in it. And that's what actually led me to ESG.
Wow, that's fascinating. Before we get into the connection with ESG. Talk about the implications for landowners. You mentioned that some of these pipelines would cross some of your farms. You are far from the only one. In fact, there are farmers all up and down Iowa and the Dakotas who are going to have big parts of their land taken, many of them under eminent domain, I guess, if they refuse to sell voluntarily, if you will. What's going on with that? How are they trying to get the farmers on board, and are farmers on board with this, and what's going on?
I would say that across the board, there are very, very, very few farmers who are on board with this. Those who are landowners and who are remote, who let's say they live in Chicago, but they invested in some real estate in Iowa, they might be in favor of it because they're going to get some money. But the challenge, really, I think there's many challenges to this. But one of them is it's very destructive of some of the most productive farmland in the world. And so when a pipeline, a carbon capture pipeline comes through, they don't just take the 8-foot wide area that the pipe is going to be sitting in, but instead they destroy an awful lot of real estate around that pipe. Many scores, hundreds of feet each side of that pipeline. And they break field tiles, which ruins the drainage and makes farm ground not usable. And they do soil compaction. And so I think it's fair to say that in a great percentage of the real estate that will be taken by this concept, that land will be rendered certainly substandard, perhaps even useless for years. So when you think about Iowa farmland or Illinois farmland or any other farmland, it's taken eons, millennia, let's say, to build up this highly productive resource. And we already know that we have a shortage of this resource going forward as the population grows. And now what's happening is that this resource, this farmland, this highly productive farmland, is going to be destroyed or at least significantly damaged by this process. But that's not probably, I mean, that's a big issue. But perhaps the bigger issue that people are concerned about is that let's suppose I own a farm and the CO2 pipeline goes through the farm. Now, CO2, we have to understand how CO2 is transported. First of all, it's a gas. So CO2 is a gas. It's in the air. We breathe out carbon dioxide on a regular basis. Plants breathe it in, and there's kind of a natural balance to the way the world works. But CO2 as a gas, in order to be transported, it has to be compressed so that it becomes a liquid. Now, before you can compress it, you must first dry it because it is so corrosive if it has moisture in it that it will eat through a steel pipeline very quickly. So how shall we compress it? Well, we're going to compress it up to 2,200 psi. So in order to transport this stuff successfully, it has to be between 1,600 and 2,200 psi. Now, at 1,600 to 2,200 psi, this is an incredibly dangerous product to be standing by. So if you imagine you're standing next to your car tire and it blows out, it could rip your leg off, and that's 35 psi. What we're talking about with CO2 is we're talking about up to 2,200 psi. And it's 5-6 feet below ground level, and it's going across the farm. Now, when it goes across the farm, sooner or later, because this always happens, there will be a rupture, there will be a leak, there will be a problem. Let's compare that to a natural gas pipeline. Natural gas pipeline is about half the pressure of a CO2 pipeline. And let's suppose we get a natural gas leak. Natural gas, being lighter than air, will rise into the atmosphere. And during that time, there's very little chance of someone dying from natural gas. However, if you take a CO2 pipeline and it explodes, or you get a rupture, a leak in it, what happens is the CO2, being heavier than air, will accumulate in low-lying areas. And there have been several instances in history where CO2 accumulating has killed thousands of people, because what it does is it displaces air, people asphyxiate for lack of oxygen. And so this is of great concern to people, the safety of this CO2 pipeline. But the other side of it that's important is to recognize that if there is a disaster, a break, that you're going to count on your local emergency crews to take care of that. Well, this requires entirely different types of equipment. For example, a truck drives into a CO2 area and it dies because there's not enough oxygen for the engine to run. So that means that you have to equip your first responders with some other type of vehicle that does not rely on an internal combustion engine. They also have to have completely different kinds of training and they have to be able to respond very, very quickly, because when a CO2 plume comes out of the ground and starts to spread, it will kill people within a matter of minutes. And so there's a concern about the safety. And I've heard several farmers being concerned about, because of this safety concern, many of them have checked with their insurance companies. If the CO2 pipeline goes across their farm and someone is killed because of that, then the insurance does not cover it. So there's just so many different issues here. There's four questions I always ask. And the first one is, does it work? And the answer is no. This whole idea of compressing CO2, sending it across the country, putting it far in the ground, does it work? Is it worth the investment? And the first answer to the question is no, that if we compress all the CO2 in Iowa that comes from ethanol plants, for example, it will be a drop in the ocean in terms of the amount of CO2 in the air. It's not the best solution. It's not even a good solution. But it's a solution that an awful lot of people are excited about, because the federal government has decided they would spend a lot of taxpayer money for people to do this, even if it's nonsensical.
That's amazing. We're going to go to a quick break, and when we get back, I want to talk about the nexus with ESG and what you guys are doing to oppose it. Folks, stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Here's the news, Dad.
Is it, son? Is it?
What about this one, Dad?
Nope. It's hard to tell what's real and what's fake these days. There's just too much baloney out there. At the New American, they cut through the baloney and give me the truth.
The truth is hard to find, but the New American has it. Check it out at thenewamerican.com.
Joe, you mentioned ESG before we went to break. What is the tie-in for the folks out there who don't remember? ESG is the environmental, social, governance, corporate metrics that they're using to transform all of our companies. Joe, what's the nexus between these carbon capture pipelines and this ESG idea?
Well, when I started looking at the carbon capture pipelines, the CO2 pipelines, I can understand that there was a lot of money, but it didn't completely make sense to me, because you have to say, okay, so this is being driven by taxpayer money, but then there's additional things that are driving this. So what is it? So eventually I began to study and understand ESG. So let's just talk about ESG for a minute. So first of all, ESG seems like it's a reasonable idea. So the concept is that let's reward companies who really do a great job and are responsible citizens for our economy, for our society, and in terms of how they govern themselves. It seems to make some sense. Let's reward those, and let's punish those who are not good corporate citizens. I mean, it seems to make some sense. The outcome of this is that this first came into play by the UN in 2006, and since that time, this has grown into an enormous industry based upon absolute fraud. So this is driven by dire warnings of climate change and the pandemic, and if we had done ESG right, we wouldn't have had a pandemic. I mean, just all sorts of things that are driving this. And it seems like a good idea, but I want to describe to you what I consider to be the four sources of fraud. The first one is the marketing hype, and I'll give you some documentation on this, because I think it's incredibly important to see the credible organizations such as the SEC that are in on this. The second one that we need to recognize, so number one is marketing hype. Number two is ratings inconsistencies. So if we take a company that has a good ESG rating and have some other rating agency come in and rate that company, they might come up with a bad ESG rating. We need to explore that. The third one is the actual methodology and the measurement of this whole idea of measuring the metrics of ESG. And finally, the language, because the language, words such as sustainability have become centerpiece in our society. And yet when two people talk about the word sustainability, they may mean completely different things. But it's like some of the other things we've seen happen in history. When someone is trying to get control of a population, what they do is they grab the language and they use the language in certain ways. So what I'd like to do is just step through some concepts of this. The first one is the marketing hype around ESG. So ESG is big business, trillions and trillions of dollars. But the most important thing to you and me and to our society is that ESG is controlling trillions of dollars of flow of money throughout the economy. And that has a huge impact on companies, it has huge impact on businesses, and it has a huge impact on society. So in terms of the marketing hype, this is like the Wolf of Wall Street. And so you've got people who are selling investments who are marketing and hyping up this whole idea of ESG. So here's the way it works, is that whether I'm talking, if I'm selling investments and I'm one of the big companies, let's suppose I'm with BlackRock, and let's suppose that I'm talking to a widow or to a banker or to some sort of a fund, maybe a pension fund, then I will talk to them about the fact that we really need to make sure that we're doing responsible, we're using our money responsibly. We're investing in companies that are going to make the world a better place. Well, that's a bunch of marketing hype, and it's brought about a whole bunch of new language. One of the most popular words that I get a kick out of is greenwashing. And the term greenwashing, what that means is that all sorts of people greenwash, they lie, in other words, in order to make things sound better than they actually are. And so I think about this in terms of the Wolf of Wall Street, but I've got a couple of pieces here I want to share with you. So this is an article that was in the USA Today, and I'm going to read this to you. It says, as a former chief investment officer, so this is a writer, of sustainable investing at BlackRock, that's the largest asset manager in the world with $8 trillion in assets, I led the charge to incorporate ESG into our global investments. In fact, our messaging helped mainstream the concept that pursuing social good was also good for the bottom line. And he says, sadly, that's all it is, a hopeful idea. In truth, sustainable investing boils down to little more than marketing hype, PR spin, and disingenuous promises from the investment community. So here's a guy who actually was at the forefront of promoting this, and he's now said this is pure marketing hype, and it really doesn't mean much to you. And I want to add one more thing, and then I'll pause for a second to see if you have some questions. But the other piece that I think is interesting is April 9th, 2021, the SEC, that's the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, issued an investment risk alert. It says, today we are issuing this risk alert to highlight observations from recent exams of investment advisors, registered investment companies, and private funds offering ESG products and services. In other words, and then it goes on and on, they say, we have discovered so many irregularities, one of the biggest of which is that there's no correlation between an organization's carbon footprint and its ESG rating, and there's no correlation between what an investment firm says is in their portfolio and whether or not that firm actually lines up with what people tend to believe is ESG investing. So the first thing that drives me nuts about this is it's a tremendous source of fraud. And then, of course, you ought to go back and say, okay, what's driving that? So that's the marketing hype. Now I'll go ahead, but let me pause for a minute and see if there's something you'd like to comment about that.
Well, this is fascinating stuff. It does sound pretty suspicious. We're just about out of time, Joe, but in the last few minutes before we go, I would like you to talk briefly about the resistance. You are, of course, one of the leaders in trying to bring this to a stop. And so if you would just share a little bit about how you guys are opposing this.
Well, in terms of ESG, this has got to concerned American citizens have got to take a stand. And quite frankly, legislatures in several states have passed laws that says that their state funds cannot be invested in products that are ESG promoted. And that is a big, huge step. And so now there are, I don't know how many states that have done that. On a regular basis, I think one of our most important things is to recognize that each of us has to take a stand. And we also need to recognize that there is absolutely no correlation. This is from research at MIT, Harvard, and other places, that there's no correlation between an organization's carbon footprint and its impact on the environment. There's no correlation between it and its ESG rating. This is pure fraud. And number one, we need to be aware of it. And we're being taken to the cleaners, and we need to be aware of it, and we need to fight it in every possible way.
Fantastic. And is there any way that you can recommend for people who want to get involved in this fight to get involved? Is there social media pages, websites, any place where people can connect?
I think first thing you can do is you need to contact your elected representatives, whether we're talking on a state level or on a federal level. So in case of Iowa right now, I live in Iowa, and my wife is a legislator in Iowa, and this is on the agenda. The legislator is working on this right now. How are we going to address this threat of carbon capture pipelines going across our state? And how are we going to begin to address and fight back against ESG that's driving? Let me give you an example. Let's suppose a company is a vile polluter of a stream. That company can raise its ESG score by adding LGBT people to its board. It can do training on critical race theory. It can try to convince its people that we're a racist society, and that raises their ESG score, and they don't have to address the fact that they're polluting local streams. This thing is absolutely diabolical.
Yeah, it is. Joe Golding, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your fascinating insights. We really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll get an update from you with some good news pretty soon. Thanks, folks. This is Conversations That Matter. I'm Alex Newman, your host for the New American Magazine. Until next time, God bless you all.
Sophia paused before the door. It read, Department of Bidigital Convergence. Just inside was a new world, a better world, the one of everlasting life, of no pain, of no loss, of no problem. She entered the chamber, and her surroundings changed. She saw around her an infinite field of waving golden grain surmounted by cloudless blue sky. The AI voice whispered gently in her mind, Welcome to the singularity. She couldn't see it and couldn't feel it, but her body had almost instantly been covered by a swarm of tiny gray multi-legged bots that melted through her clothes and into her skin. Not perceiving the nightmare, her eyes had already been consumed and the rest of her body was dissolving as the bots digested her flesh. She felt only a warmth suffusing her being. Drowsy, she drifted to sleep, and her last thought was one of panic. Would she ever wake? Could a nightmare vision like this be an outcome of the much-hyped transhumanist technological singularity? Enter the world of the future as illuminated by the experience of the past in Endgame, the new book by Dennis Barrett, the publisher of the New American Magazine, and find out how the disastrous COVID pandemic response fits with the technocratic elite's thirst to create a transhumanist utopia. Get Endgame from shopjbs.org with free shipping with code ENDSHIP, ENDSHIP. Or get Endgame and the Great Reset Collector's issue of the New American Magazine and get free shipping plus an additional 20% off both with code END20, END20.